Now we're open for discussion, panel discussions. Could you come to the front? Do we have microphones around? Okay, so we have microphones. All right. So who wants to start? But for your information, we have many people online watching us. If they wanted to send us any questions or messages, please do so. Okay, David, Mark.
Well, I'll just start. I mean, this is the beauty of an IFPRI seminar, that a speaker can get up with a straight face and say we should tax biofuels. That's just great. That's just great. but in the political arena, probably not very realistic. So I guess I'd just like the speakers to comment a bit on what they might see evolving out of the G20 on biofuels. I know that the U.S. Is a bit reticent at the highest levels to talk much about biofuels.
Thank you. Mark?
Charlotte, or anybody else in the panel, I was wondering if you could comment on, is there any like dramatic movements by either coalitions of the developing countries or OECD countries that you think could really jumpstart the WTO round? I mean, you said, as you said, most people are writing off completely, but is there actually some way out of the trap we're in now?
All right. Okay, this side. There's a hand this side. We should have a microphone handler to stand this side.
Marie Brill from ActionAid, and we've been following very closely the G20 lead up and very much appreciating the international agency report that's been informing some of those processes. And I would be interested to hear a little bit more of your perspectives on what seems to be kind of the headline that's likely to come out of the G20, which is around transparency and this AMIS concept, as well as how we can sort of in very practical ways be elevating the far more controversial elements of the agenda, like food reserves and biofuels, since it looks like on those 2 points, at the Ag Minister meeting, it will be very difficult for them to come to a consensus about how to move forward, but might still be able to have some potential as we move throughout the year, leading up to the actual Leaders Summit to make some inroads and some progress in the thinking. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more of your analysis on those.
Thank you. Did you say your name is Maria Rowe?
Marie Brill.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
We have a Marie Rowe who is a division director here. All right. So why don't we start the first round of the questions. Charlotte, you want to deal with the WTO negotiation, Doha round?
Sure. I mean, my sense is that obviously politically the stars are not aligned to conclude the round this year. Now, I think it's important on the one hand that you reach some kind of an agreement by December, so you have a successful outcome of that ministerial, therefore discussions about Plan B, but it also makes me a little bit nervous, to be honest, because the issues that are being talked about for Plan B are issues that are going to be rather difficult, in particular for the U.S. So I'm a little bit nervous about a repeat of the Hong Kong ministerial, because you've got duty-free, quota-free for LDCs and cotton, both of which are not going to be that easy to do for the U.S. So at IPC, we've actually tried to throw in a few more things that could be part of a Plan B. And I think if you couch all of this in the food security context, that would actually be very smart. So that I think would be a smart thing to do. Now, in the long run, it's ironic because the ag package of the Doha round is more or less done. I mean, there are still some controversial issues, but my understanding is that even the most controversial, which is the SSM, consensus seems to be plausible there. So, you know, it's ironic because, again, historically, agriculture has always been the most difficult and most sensitive sector on which to conclude. But here, really, most of the difficulties are in the NAMA sector. And Whether we can actually close a deal or not remains to be seen. I certainly hope we can. I know that a lot of people think a lot of the issues that are being debated now are out of date, and we've got to jump on with all the new issues. I think all the old issues still matter a lot, and we should conclude the round also so that we can move forward with some of the newer issues. I think otherwise the trade agenda is just going to become too complicated. Maybe just a quick word on biofuels. I chuckled at the idea of taxing biofuels. I don't think it's going to happen, given the concerns that you see about desire to bring on renewable energies, et cetera. I don't think we're going to be able to stop biofuels, but I think we're going to have to be very smart about the policies that we use. So certainly I think subsidies should be phased out. I think there should be free trade in biofuels. I think that's the most that we can hope to accomplish. I don't see any kind of tax or prohibition of biofuels coming our way.
Peter, political feasibility of taxing biofuel.
So with a straight face, I suggest
some of the emerging economies are also.
Well,
some of the
certainly,
emerging economies
China, Indonesia, India, all going down this road. Yes, it was with a straight face that I suggested we needed some kind of a tax on the use of grains and vegetable oils for the production of liquid fuels. So I was reasonably precise in what I'm hoping for. Look, I started writing seriously about the economics of food price stabilization and the desirability of putting in place mechanisms to stabilize food prices back in the 1980s. So I've got a long memory and I've got a long time horizon. I'm quite prepared to think that 15 years from now we'll actually have active debates about how you tax the use of grains and vegetable oils in biofuel production. Not whether it's desirable, but how do you do it so there isn't too much slippage, too much inefficiency, too much waste. So I'm prepared to wait a decade or more if we need to. I just want to get it on the agenda. Using maize to produce ethanol is a bad idea. So of course we should stop the subsidies, we should stop the mandates because it's a bad idea. But do we need to go further? Well, let's figure out whether it's feasible. What kind of policy initiatives would you use? What kind of taxing mechanism? Let's at least get the question on the analytical agenda and start doing the work, because you can't get the right answer if you haven't done the work. I mean, you push evidence-based policy making. I think that's absolutely right. But let's get the evidence. Let's get the analytical mechanisms figured out. Let's get the data and do the empirics.
Well, thank you, Peter. Rob, do you want to add anything on some of the issues, including the question from the third discussant?
Sure. If you look at the dominant responses by countries in 2008, it was trade responses, export bans, and grain stock responses, releases. So I think if we make progress on the G20 on those, in addition to the productivity, I think it would be useful. And I think one is transparency, in terms of transparency of production. When you see the USDA forecast releases and you look at the price movements, the minutes after that, they almost go to the limit. And so how can more transparent, more accurate, more rigorous forecasts be made? I think that may be a useful area to progress on. On export bans and trade restrictions, I think if you look at the countries which imposed export bans, it's countries which are obviously net exporters, but also had on average, the share of budgets spent on food was relatively high. So you had a large constituency advocating for export bans. And if that discussion is complemented with ensuring safety nets are in place in some of those largest exporting countries, where they have a large share of the population spending a large part of their household budgets on food, perhaps there would be more or less domestic pressure to impose export bans.
Sure. Well, I wanted to respond to that too. The export ban sometimes is actually against the poor in some of the countries. In the case of China, when China imposed the export ban in 2007, so the Chinese prices, domestic prices, were only half of that international prices. That really involved large welfare transfer from the rural producers to urban consumers. So it's a very strong political lobby from the urban centers. So actually smallholders really lost an opportunity to increase their income. So, but to use the protection of the poor as a reason, Peter, maybe you have a different explanation.
Well, one of the reasons, at least India and Vietnam went through this export ban process, it's designed to influence price expectations of the marketing sector, to some extent of consumers as well, to prevent hoarding. If you think that prices are not going to go continually higher following world prices, then you don't have to go into the market and buy another 20 kilos of rice and put it in your village or in your kitchen pantry. And keeping that kind of panic behavior, at least in the rice economy, from happening keeps price expectations under control and then keeps prices under control. So that's really a very desirable thing. Rob noted that only exporting countries imported export bans, but that's actually not true. Indonesia announced an export ban on rice when they hadn't exported rice for 15 years. Why did they do that? They did it to make sure that everybody understood that no matter how high world prices went, they were not going to permit exports. Domestic prices would stay stable. Domestic prices did stay stable after that. It was a great policy coup. They were able to stabilize prices with a single statement from the Minister of Trade. So I think we've got to understand the nature of expectations, price expectations, and how they get formed if we're going to deal with short-run volatility. Longer-run supply-demand balances, expectations have virtually nothing to do with it. But if we're worried about short-run price behavior, we have to understand expectations, and there's lots of things that economists just don't understand that policymakers probably do.
Yeah. All right. Let's go around another round.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Wait for the microphone.
Michael Docchio, two quick questions. One is, given the difficulties with multilateral trade agreements, what's to stop countries from engaging in bilateral trading, just getting on with it, if that suits countries in terms of freeing up trade and so on and so forth? I don't think the two are necessarily exclusive. And the other question is, what exactly are we addressing in terms of food security? I'm getting the impression here that if we just produce more and more grain, we just fill people up with grain, that might address sort of filling your tummy. But for 70% of people that are food insecure, women and children, it's nutritional insecurity as much as food insecurity. And it's not just about grain. Grain seems to be the low-hanging fruit. It's about animal protein and the importance of animal protein in the diet of women during pregnancy, infants, and so on and so forth. So are we just trying to address easy solutions and avoiding the more difficult issue of nutritional security?
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? All right, there's one in the back.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Schmidt. I'm from the German Embassy, and I would like to shift the focus a little bit. Economists are rather unsatisfied with the fact that agriculture is underinvested. So how could bring back the investment to agriculture? And I think a real important factor is a reasonable price, which should be higher than the prices we've seen in the past. That will cause another problem for people who don't have money to buy that food. And I think we should focus on that issue too. We should not focus too much on the prices for maize or oils or other vegetable fats driven up by biofuel production, but we should also focus on this special issue, how to feed the poor without depressing the prices for agricultural goods. Thank you.
Oh, I wanted to add a question here. Peter, you mentioned about speculation. You said, well, large financial speculation really increased the price volatility. But well, you said we're evidence-based. If we use a 2007, 2008 around crisis data, we couldn't prove any evidence. Then in the recent around 2010, 2011, again, it's rather difficult to say, yes, we do see lots of transactions over there, but when you try to do an econometric analysis, you don't find any relationship. Yes, I do not deny that, yes, financial institutions are trading commodities. Yeah, food is part of the overall commodity index, so that really pushes the price. But the higher price could also attract investment. Well, obviously, this issue will be divided probably across Atlantic. The other side will push very hard to introduce regulations. This side probably will push back, let the market work. So I just wanted to hear from you, how can we really make it as evidence-based?
I think the reason we're having a hard time finding evidence that financial speculation affects prices is we don't have the right model of price formation. In the short run, we have to figure out what causes expectations to be what they are, and I would argue that massive inflows of financial capital into commodity markets is a big factor influencing expectations, not just in the financial community, but outside. It affects what farmers think, it affects what consumers, what traders think. I watch it with the rice economy. I don't know how big a factor it is. But watching that financial interest, I can make money by buying long commodities. I don't have to take delivery. I'm not interested in any of the characteristics, but I can make money doing that. Now, does that have any impact? I mean, Scott Irwin and the folks are basically arguing, unless you can affect the inventory levels at the spot delivery point, you're not affecting the real economy, you're not affecting real prices. But if you affect expectations, and not all of those inventories are in the public record. I mean, that's part of the transparency problem that we have. So I just don't think we're looking for the mechanisms by which financial investments will alter expectations and alter behavior and change and then change at least the volatility. I think I was pretty firm in saying you've got to have some trigger in the real supply-demand balance, whether it's low stocks or whatever. But you know, we went through the 2008 price spike. Rice was the biggest of the price spikes, and stock-to-use ratios for rice had been improving for 4 years in a row. So the notion that Brian Wright has is, oh, you know, stock-to-use, low stock-to-use ratios explains price spikes. It just doesn't. It just doesn't work there. What we got was panic. Mm-hmm. And panic was driven by the speculation out there that said, oh, you know, we're running out of commodities. So I think it's really important to have a model of short-run price formation that allows these kinds of variables to have an impact. If you define them away, they won't show up.
Right. But in the rice sector, rice is not traded. Well,
and see, we don't even have financial speculation on rice to speak of.
Right. Anyway, we wanted to address the questions raised by Mark and the one from German embassy, Thomas. Yeah. Shall I?
On regional trade agreements, absolutely. I mean, they're taking place. There's a new one cropping up almost every day, and you can get a lot done in those agreements, but probably mostly in the market access area. So the partners of a trade agreement will end up with increased market access at the end of an agreement. You can't really get at things like domestic support because that's got to be done at the international arena. It just hasn't been treated in a regional agreement. So I think it's very, very important. And then you've also got this whole issue of whether regional trade agreements, what's the impact of those agreements on non-participants. So in general, I mean, we certainly see this as a phenomenon. We're working on them, but we would think it's very important also to have very strong rules at the multilateral level. Just in response to your question, Thomas, and I think that's, I don't know whose slide it was that put up the two IFPRI statements about, the complaints about the low prices and now the complaints about high prices. I think we ought to let the markets determine what the prices are, and I think some price volatility is not a bad thing. If prices didn't change, we wouldn't have any signals to increase production, increase supply. I think what we do need to worry about are these very extreme price movements in either direction, and if they go down or up, and so that's, I think, what we need to focus on, and I think that gets confused a lot in the discussion. And also, just one other thing on this impact of high prices on the poor, I think we tend to generalize a lot on this issue. I think it's very much a case-by-case issue. The bank, for example, just recently put out a very interesting set of studies where they looked at this really on a country-by-country basis, and they found that in some countries, higher food prices were actually good for the poor because over the longer run, the producers who generally tend to buy more food than they actually sell could become net sellers over time. So I think we need to be very careful about some of these statements we're making. It depends very much on a country-by-country basis. But in general, I would agree that a slowly rise in prices is actually a good thing because it means we've got to produce more and it means we've got to invest more in agriculture, which is, after all, the number one priority.
Peter, then Rob.
The slide I put up was one of several. I put the IFPRI one up because we're sitting here at IFPRI, but we've got one from the World Bank. There's one from Oxfam. Prices were too low in 2003. Prices were too high in 2008. Now, you can say, well, those guys don't know what they're talking about. They don't understand. Markets get the price right all the time. So, we shouldn't be worrying about it. But the alternative interpretation is that there's actually a right price that's somewhere between too low and too high, and then maybe it's worth trying to figure out what that right price is, and then what are the mechanisms that would keep us reasonably close to that right price. I call that price stabilization. You can call it whatever you want, but the notion that there is a price out there that sends appropriate signals for production, that protects consumers over the longer run, that doesn't solve the problem of poverty. I think Thomas Schmidt's right to say, wait a minute, there's a problem of poverty here that is almost independent of what the food price happens to be at any given time. Yes, the poor will be somewhat more vulnerable if they're exposed to high prices. On the other hand, if they're in rural areas and real wages are pulled up by agricultural productivity increases, it might be good for them. So it's country by country and topic by topic. But the notion that there might be a right price out there strikes me as a really important concept that we ought to be looking at.
Right, Peter, since you mentioned about IFPRI, well, indeed in 2003 we were complaining about lower prices. Why prices were low? That's because subsidies from OECD countries, not because the overproduction or increased production from poor countries. That's one. Let me finish. Then 2008, why price is so high? Well, that's because other factors. Well, potentially smallholders can gain. Smallholders in Africa, South Asia can gain, but they're facing lack of access to markets, to inputs, to fertilizers, to service. So they cannot enjoy higher prices. Who will? OECD countries, and probably China and India to some extent. Well, as Rob said in his slide, after 2007, 2008 food crisis, it's China, India, Brazil, in the developing country who really responded very quickly. China increased its agriculture spending by more than 50% just in a single year. India by 30%, but Africa, not so much. Rob, Peter, you still wanted to say something briefly?
Just quickly, let's be careful about the mechanisms by which we got those low prices. Yes, the subsidies from the rich countries dumping into the world market, that caused low prices. Those low prices really encouraged the destocking from India and China that Rob showed us, and the real depression in prices from 1999 to 2003 are because we were putting about 20 million tons of grain in that we weren't producing. It's an identity. If you got that consumption going up smoothly, there was just no incentive to keep production up. And so that real trough, the bottom of the world food prices between 99 and 2003 comes because we dumped stocks in the world market, and it was just not profitable to hold those stocks.
Right. Rob?
Okay.
Yeah, just 2 points. The one on nutrition security versus food security. I think calorie intake, I think both are important. The estimates from FAO on the spike and the number of undernourished is a calorie-based estimate showing an increase of, I think it was 150, 200 million people. So I think just the availability of calories is important. And I don't think we should lose sight of that. But sort of vitamin deficiency is also an issue. And I think there needs to be increased investment through biofortification, but also an improved understanding, perhaps additional research questions where, for example, in India, which is not the poorest, but has the highest number of malnourished, what are the driving factors? Is it just the way they cook the food? Is it a food safety issue that they cook all the nutrients out of any food they have because of hygiene? So I think there's some research agenda on that point. The second, I think, is on, I just have a comment on price levels versus volatility. I think what the point is on the volatile prices are impacting expectations of investors in agriculture. If they think that prices tomorrow will be much lower than they are today, they're not going to invest. And so I think the concern is that the volatility is dampening incentives to invest even in an era of higher average prices. So you don't get the sufficient supply response.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Rob. Just for your information, we are really looking at the distinct between agriculture growth and nutrition outcome very seriously. We had a big conference in India last February to look at the agriculture, nutrition, and health linkages. The CGIAR also has a very large research program on that issue. So about $40–50 million a year. It's a research program to look at the distinct between agriculture growth and nutrition and health outcome. Well, we have 2 questions from online. All right. Can you tell us what are the questions?
Yes. The first question, excuse me.
Just speak to the microphone.
Steve Baragona with Voice of America. And he asks, would the panelists like to look into their crystal balls and predict what the final G20 ag ministers communique will say? The second question is from Tom Slayton. And this question is directed to Peter. He says, you commented that India and China took a benign role in the 2007-08 food crisis. Is that actually accurate vis-a-vis India? I think India was a leading instigator in the former crisis and could have played a more helpful role in the recent run-up in wheat and rice prices.
Okay, Peter, looks like these 2 questions are addressed to you.
Well, first, what's the memo of the ag ministers going to say? And the answer is nothing. So that's easy. It'll be 22 pages long, single space, 11-pitch type, but it won't really say anything.
Right. This will be recorded in the Voice of America.
Somebody pointed out that I could say with a straight face that we ought to tax biofuels, but that's because I don't have any institutional responsibilities any longer. I can just... So, for Tom Slayton, I hope I didn't say that China and India stayed out of the 2008, because he knows that I understand that India was the real instigator with the export ban on rice and triggered the panic both in buying and in market behavior, the hoarding that took place right across the rice economy in Asia. So that if I did say that, I take it back. But I certainly didn't intend to say that India gets off as a non-involvement. That I don't think that was right. So.
Yeah, indeed, actually, India's ban triggered a whole round of rice export bans in Asia, followed by China, Vietnam,
I did
Cambodia.
say what I did say, maybe he misheard me. I did say Indonesia announced an export ban even though they hadn't exported any rice in 15 years, and that caused Indonesia to be able to keep its prices stable. There was no panic in Indonesia. Their prices stayed stable right through 07, 08 without any impact from the world food crisis at all.
Rob, so what do you expect from the G20? Anything real coming out of G20?
A lot more work from development agencies to finalize the recommendations. No, but yeah, I think there has been a lot of effort and thought among the development agencies on that document, and I think some things will have more traction than others. But I hope that it's. Yeah, that there is the due attention to the longer-term productivity agenda.
Yeah. Charlotte, are you as what?
I mean, I think the two key issues would be this long-term focus on ag productivity, increased investment. I don't know how much we can hope for from governments these days, so I think we also need to be thinking about private sector investments and really being smart about attracting those private sector investments into the ag sector. And then the other big priority is open trade, I think, where the G20 might want to weigh in on. I think actually we're sort of at a tricky point in sort of international governance, right? WTO is not going very well. Climate change negotiations are not going very well. G20 has been held up as maybe a new international body to help us see through various issues. I think if all we get is a lot of talk, that would be a big disappointment. So hopefully, the countries themselves, rather than having yet another call to conclude the Doha round or another call to increase productivity in agriculture, can actually make some commitments and then live by those commitments. That would be great to see. I don't know if we will, but that would be great.
Mm-hmm. Peter, last word.
Rob suggested that the $22 billion that was pledged at L'Aquila ought to be sort of repledged and commitments made. They just pledged $20 billion for democratic movements in North Africa. And there is a sense in the development community that I watch that there's sort of $20 billion that they allocate each year and never spend. It would be really nice to get them to come out and say, yes, we're actually going to commit it and spend it on agriculture.